Hey there, race fans. It's Race Day Top 5 with me, Frank 5. Phoenix, Arizona, the desert, the final race of the West Coast Swing. This weekend we went out to Phoenix and we had some relatively interesting moments during the race and our first back-to-back repeat winner of 2023. Let's get into all that went down in the desert sun. Number 1, William Byron wins back-to-back races for the first time in his Cup Series career by winning yesterday's United Rentals Worked United 500 at Phoenix Raceway, holding off Ryan Blaney, Tyler Reddick, Kyle Larson, and Kevin Harvick for the victory. Talk about a West Coast swing that William Byron's had. After a terrible start to the year with the Daytona 500 crash and speeding penalty at Fontana, California, he rebounds with back-to-back wins in back-to-back weekends. Dominated last week in Las Vegas, led the most laps, won both stages, won the race in overtime. This weekend backed it up with a really good run at Phoenix. It was a really good race car at the beginning, starting in the top 5. Took the lead from his teammate Kyle Larson after the first couple of laps and started driving away. And it seemed like nobody could touch him, even though Kyle Larson tried to keep close distance like last weekend, for example. Byron was successful in stage 1 by winning the first stage. Then stage 2, he lost the lead on pit stops to Kyle Larson and kind of hovered around second or third place for a majority of that stage, not really being able to run down and pass Kyle Larson, but it just showed you how strong those Hendrick cars were yesterday. And Byron seemed to be, I think, comfortable for at least contending for the win or getting a top 3 finish. Then in the start of his final stage, he slipped back a little bit further to 5th spot, and it looked like the handling, especially in the long runs, wasn't really his best friend, and it looked like he was going to be content to run in the top 5 at the very end. Well, then we had a caution come out with 10 laps to go when Harrison Burton spun, and that set up everyone to come down pit road to come for green flag, come for pit stops and 4 tires and fuel. Well, William Byron's team rolled the dice, took a gamble, and went with 2 tires. And the 2 tires paid off massively. They started on the front row on the next to last restart. Then we had a quickie yellow, which set up overtime. And on the restart, Byron got the jump from Larson off of number 2, took the lead, and didn't look back and picked up his second win of the season and in only his 6th career victory. After those first 2 rough races, Byron is knocking it out of the park right now, and they've had good race cars, so let's say that. Let's get that out of the way. Really, in those other 2 races that we started the year and he didn't get the finishes, he was still running really well. He had good race speed, and he's had phenomenal race speed the past 2 races, last weekend and yesterday. That 24 team has seemed to have gotten their act together to be a championship contender in the early portion of the season and showing that they are forced to be reckoning with. Now, they do need to work a little bit on long runs because it wasn't their best friend yesterday. The short runs, that's where they shine the best. But I will say, props to Rudy Fugle for that 2-tire gamble on the caution that came out with 10 laps to go for them to come down pit road, put on 2 tires, and get that track position that they needed to get up front and have a chance to contend for the win. And they ended up walking out of there with a victory. That's impressive stuff. And a really big weekend, not just for Byron, but the Hendrick team, because they had a parts confiscation on Friday after practice. NASCAR saw something with like the front air vents and the hood that they didn't really like, so they confiscated all 4 of those parts from all 4 of the Hendrick cars, and we're still waiting on possible penalties, but for the moment, they put in those brand new parts, and it didn't seem to hurt that 24 or the other Hendrick cars whatsoever yesterday. A great performance by William Byron and that 24 team. Number 2, Kyle Larson, back-to-back weeks, could have gotten the win, but late race yellows and late race mishaps cost them. Kyle Larson was so strong yesterday, like his teammate. Started on the pole, led the first couple laps, slipped back to second, and then the start of the second stage, Larson took the lead on pit stops, and he just started driving away from everybody, especially on the long runs. Even though they weren't his best friend either, he was still really, really strong and had a good enough lead to hold that lead, especially when we had the long runs and green flag pit stops. Larson, like, nobody could seem to touch him at all, and he captured stage 2 and started stage 3. He was strong again. It looked like he was going to run away with it, but then with about 40 laps to go, he was caught by Kevin Harvick. He got passed for the lead, and Larson just kept running the top when his crew chief Cliff Daniels on the radio was telling him, you got to run the bottom in 3 and 4. You got to run the bottom in 3 and 4, and he wasn't doing that. But I think his car was too loose to run the bottom, especially when you get on the bottom and the car is really loose, you could slip up and lose the back end and maybe spin around and maybe crash the race car. So it was better for him to try to run the middle groove of 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 rather than running the bottom and risk spinning out the car and possibly wrecking it. So I can't really blame Kyle Larson for running that groove. And then when that caution came out, I thought this is the perfect opportunity for them to win the race, especially knowing we're going to have a short run. And he, like Byron, took 2 tires, got the lead off of pit road, had the lead on the restart, and then we went to overtime. It looked like he was going to win, but Byron got the better restart than the 5 car did. And the 5 car slipped back to 4th spot when he was getting shuffled by other guys from behind. So it really sucks because it looked like back-to-back weeks it was going to be Kyle Larson winning instead of William Byron, but late race yellows kind of hindered him. But nonetheless, another solid run for the 5 team yesterday, and like the 24, bouncing back from 2 rough races to start the year with back-to-back races where they're strong and competitive. They're going to get to victory lane soon, I guarantee that. Number 3, Kevin Harvick, the Cactus King, almost got his 10th win at this track, but falls short to the wayside. Kevin Harvick started 16th in the race yesterday, but slowly, methodically worked his way up to the front. How'd he do that? Fast race car and long runs. They were his best friend yesterday. They got up to the top 5 by the start of stage 2 and pretty much hung around the 3rd spot that entire stage. And then the final stage, they got to 2nd place, passing William Byron, and as we got into a longer run, he kept running down Kyle Larson, and on the pit stops, Larson had a slower stop, Harvick had a faster stop, but still came out behind him in 2nd. But with 40 laps to go, for the first time all day, Harvick passed the leader under green flag conditions instead of under yellow. It was legitimately under green flag conditions after they cycled through pit stops. Harvick took the lead, and he looked like he was going to run away with the thing. But again, the caution came out with 10 laps to go, and I think in the radio, even though he didn't say anything, I could tell Harvick was pretty upset about that. But at the same time, what are you going to do? So they came down pit road, they took 4 tires, assuming everyone else was going to take 4, but obviously other guys rolled the dice with 2 tires. Harvick tried his best to get back to the front on those last 2 restarts. It just wasn't enough, but he comes home with a 5th place finish nonetheless. This was Kevin Harvick's 20th straight top 10 finish at Phoenix Raceway. This man has finished since the 2013 fall race, which he won, by the way, in his last win for Richard Childress Racing. He's been in the top 10 at the finish at Phoenix Raceway, that track, ever since that fall race in 2013. That's an impressive stat. And had he won yesterday, he would have joined an elite group of drivers that have won at a racetrack or more 10 or more times. Richard Petty has won at 5 different racetracks 10 or more times. Darrell Waltrip, he's won at Bristol and Martinsville more than 10 times. David Pearson, 10 wins at Darlington. Jimmy Johnson, 11 wins at Dover. Kevin Harvick could have joined that group yesterday with the win, but unfortunately, again, the yellow coming out hurt him, because if we had gone green the rest of the way, again, the long runs were his best friend, and he was gapping the 5 car after he took the lead, because the long runs were not Larson's best friend, and Harvick was just so strong in those long runs. But this does give the 4 team optimism for when we come back here in the fall. And if he is a part of the championship 4, by the time we come back here to decide a champion, he could be the favorite, legitimately the favorite. Not just because he's so good at this racetrack, but because of how good he was on the long runs. And also, shout out to Kevin Harvick, because, again, this is his final season in the Cup Series. And so far, the guy's having a great start to his final year. His worst finish is 11th in the Daytona 500, which, by the way, was a mangled race car at the very end. But ever since then, top 5 at Fontana, top 10 last weekend, top 5 yesterday, even though they had race-winning speed on those long runs and looked like they were going to win and had the caution not come out with 10 laps to go. But despite all that, despite coming up short, it was still a good result for the 4 team. It showed signs that they are getting closer to victory lane, and once again, carrying Stewart-Haas Racing on his shoulders. But in his final year, Harvick is so far doing a really good job. Number 4, drivers with much needed runs yesterday and finishes. Guys got some really good finishes yesterday after having a relatively rough start to their year. Starting with 2nd place Ryan Blaney. He finished 9th in the Daytona 500, but the past 2 weekends, not really the best of finishes. Was a good car at Fontana, but was caught up in that front stretch melee on the restart. And then last week at Vegas, started in the top 5, but then slipped to the back, in the top 15. They just were not good, especially on long runs, and they didn't have the balance. They kept battling a vibration for the most part. But yesterday, ran top 10 the entire race. I don't think he ever fell out of the top 10. That was a good, solid top 10 car yesterday, and the best of the Penske cars, because his other 2 teammates did not have good runs at all yesterday. Blaney got up to the battling for the lead at one point in those late race restarts, and down the backstretch off of turn 2 on the final restart in overtime, it looked like he was possibly gonna be able to slide past those 2 Hendrick cars if they had make contact with each other. But unfortunately, he slipped back after Byron cleared them. But Blaney coming away with a second place finish. It's still a really good result for him. Then we go to the man who finished third, Tyler Reddick. This is his first year with 2311 Racing, and the first 2 races for him, DNF, DNF. Wrecked at Daytona, wrecked at Fontana. Then last weekend, they had a good race car the entire day, and it looked like they were going to finish in the top 10, but they had a little scuffle with the ball with about 60 laps to go, and unfortunately, they came away with a top 15, which should have been a top 10, but it was still a good result to make up for the first 2 races that did not go well for them. But this weekend, they had a good race car the entire day and were one of the best Toyotas, especially at the end of the race on those long runs. The 45 car came alive. And on that restart, those late race restarts, he, like Kevin Harvick, took 4 tires aside from some other guys that took 2 on that final pit stop to set up those 2 restarts. Reddick used the 4 tires and got straight up to 4th before the caution came out, setting up overtime. And I think Reddick's in the catbird seat to win this race. Unfortunately, he couldn't get by those Hendrick cars when they were side by side. He did give Byron the shove he needed to catapult himself in front of the 5 and the 12 to go on and win the race. Unfortunately, Reddick ran a little too high in 3 and 4 when I felt like he could have gotten a good launch going into the corner to try to at least get to the 24 and the 5. Unfortunately, he slipped back to 3rd. But again, a great result for the 45 team, and they really needed that. Then we go to Chase Briscoe, Kevin Harvick's teammate, the man who got his first career win in the Cup Series at this track in this race last year. They really needed this run, a 7th place finish, because, quite frankly, like Reddick start to the year, no luck whatsoever. They crashed in the Daytona 500. They struggled really bad at Fontana despite getting a 20th place at the end. They struggled really, really bad last weekend outside the top 20 at Las Vegas. It was just not good for them. This weekend, much better result for the 14 team. And they were relatively competitive, hovering around the top 10 all day long, and they came away with a 7th place finish. That's where they deserve to be. I mean, they really needed this run to give the team some confidence going forward, and hopefully they can start running better and running up towards the front with their teammate. And then Josh Berry, his second race in a relief role for Chase Elliott in the 9 car, came away with a 10th place finish yesterday. Very impressive after, being put in this position while Chase recovers from his tibia injury. Berry had a struggle last weekend being thrown into the car at the last second. And, it was tough for him, especially despite the little track time he got. This weekend, he got much more time in the simulator and time on the track for practice because we had a new aero package we were debuting, and everybody needed a couple extra minutes of practice to feel the card out with this package and see how it worked. Berry got some good track time with this, qualified 17th, hovered around the top 15, top 20 most of the day, but much more competitive effort from him, aside from last weekend, of course, when he was thrown into the role. But he benefited from those 2 late race yellows and got himself up to a position where he could finish strong and ended up coming home with a solid 10th place finish. All the Hendrick cars finished in the top 10 yesterday. Of course, Byron won, Larson finished 4th, Alex Bowman finished 9th, and he's now the championship leader after 4 straight races, the first 4 races of the year. All of them, he's been in the top 10. That's very impressive. That's consistency right there. And Berry, for this race, to kind of silence the people think, is he really worth a relief driver until Chase comes back? I think he silenced a lot of those people yesterday. So kudos to Josh Berry, and good job by him and those other guys for getting some really good runs yesterday. And number 5, short track aero package, a brand new aero package we debuted for these next-gen cars. Last year when we ran these cars on tracks a mile or shorter, a lot of people kind of complained about the racing product because they felt like there was not a lot of side-by-side action, drivers getting up on the wheel and using, their arms in the car to, fight the race car, because they felt like with the package that we had, especially with the braking, the cars handled too well. Meaning there was hardly any need for adjustments or guys slipping and sliding out there. There was they handled well, especially when you got on the brakes, because we have a little smoother brake package with this next-gen car than we did with the Gen 6 car. So NASCAR decided, you know what? For the short tracks, we're going to do something to try to help reduce the downforce and make the racing a little more competitive and put on a show for the fans. So they reduced the downforce by at least 30%. They took some of the back panels under the rear end near the diffuser away and shortened the rear spoiler from 4 inches to 2 inches and took a good portion of the front splitter of the race car away to hope for some good racing. Did we get it yesterday? Well, one race down, it's a work in progress, shall I say. It was pretty quiet the first two stages. The final stage, I felt like we had a little more competition, and we saw something in the final stage that we didn't see the first two stages. Somebody passed the race leader for the lead under green flag conditions, and it wasn't just during a pit stop. It was like legitimately ran him down and passed him, and that was Kevin Harvick taking the lead from Kyle Larson. But you also cannot deny, when we come to Phoenix, the one thing you're excited for is those restarts, because they are just fanning out everywhere. 3, 4, 5 wide down the dog leg before they get into turn one. You saw a lot of that in some of those late race restarts yesterday. And there was some good competitive side-by-side action and passing in the final stage and in those late race restarts. So I felt like the fans got a little something out of that. It's still a work in progress for this short track package. I feel like that we're going to need to learn a little bit more. Martinsville's the real test, especially after last year's races weren't the best for Martinsville standards. We hope that this package maybe can change that. And when we go there in April next month, let's hope it solves those issues and we can have a really competitive race and a solid show for the fans, because they come to see short track racing, beat and bang, side-by-side action, possibly a fight to the finish, a race to the finish, side-by-side, like Jimmy Johnson and Jeff Gordon in 07, but we'll see what happens. But yesterday, I feel like as the race progressed, we started to see guys have a little bit more of a, jerking the car, trying to fight the car, no grip, no turn, like all that stuff you heard on the radio. That's kind of what they dealt with yesterday. So hopefully this first race we worked out the kinks, and maybe it gets better when we go to these short tracks that are shorter than our mile or less on the schedule. So we'll see what happens, but I think at the very end of the race yesterday, we saw some good action with this package. So the West Coast swing's officially done. We're headed back to the East Coast, and next week we're off to Atlanta Motor Speedway, or Atlanta Super Speedway, shall I say, because it's now kind of runs like a super speedway, like we saw both of those races last year. Some really competitive racing. They'll be running in big groups next weekend, side by side, pretty much, in the throttle in the straightaways, off the throttle in the corners, even though they'll be bunched up, bumper to bumper the entire time. It'll be interesting, especially when we have the pit road entrance lined up at the backstretch going into turn 3 to kind of help with the cars when they're all bunched together and running those, pack racing speeds for a mile and a half. It'll be very interesting. But we saw some great racing last year and saw some pretty interesting battles to the finish, where we saw William Byron and Chase Elliott win. Unfortunately, we won't see our Georgia boy there next weekend. We still wish him a speedy recovery and hope to have him back in the car soon. He'll definitely be back in this car for the summer race when we come here in July. But what will happen next weekend? Will Byron go 3 in a row, something he's never done before? I mean, he went back-to-back for the first time in his career this past 2 races. Can he go 3 in a row next weekend? We shall see. Will Kevin Harvick or Kyle Larson make up for the ones that got away yesterday and get into victory lane next weekend? Or will our defending champ Joey Logano, Kyle Busch in his strong starts the year with his new team, or somebody else, maybe our Daytona 500 winner Ricky Stenhouse, who had good speed at these races last year, could put up a fight? We'll see what happens when we go to Georgia next weekend. So hope you all have a wonderful week. Subscribe, like. Congrats once again to William Byron and the 24 team on winning back-to-back races at Las Vegas and yesterday in the desert in Phoenix. Have a great week, everybody. Let's go racing!